In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding async await within JavaScript. I'm first going to give you an overview of what async await is and what these keywords are within JavaScript. And then I'm going to go over several examples here of how it works and how you can use it in your programs. All right. So first things first here, what is async await? An async function is a function declared with the async keyword. So async is a keyword within JavaScript that you can put before functions, and that tells JavaScript, hey, this is an asynchronous function. And then the await keyword is a keyword that can be used within an asynchronous function, and it needs to be used within an asynchronous function, but it allows you to pause your async function until some promise either resolves or rejects. So it's like, hey, let's just hold on. Let's stop this function for now. Let's go do some other stuff within JavaScript. And then once this promise resolves or rejects, then we will come back to this kind of line of code within this function. And then it will continue running that function once that promise is like all settled and all completed. And these async and await keywords, as you might have guessed, allow you to perform asynchronous JavaScript. And async await can kind of give you a syntax that just looks a bit cleaner and can be a little bit more easy to reason about. And it is probably the most modern way to handle asynchronous programming within JavaScript. So moving in to some examples of how these work. So to create an asynchronous function here, what you need to do is use the async keyword, and you are going to place that keyword right in front of your function declaration. So as you can see here, I use the keyword async. And then following that keyword, I create a normal function declaration. So this is an asynchronous function called getData. And then I could have some logic within the body of my function here. Now, for an asynchronous function, they can take various arguments, just like a normal function. There's not really anything special when it comes to passing arguments to an asynchronous function. However, unlike normal functions, they will always return a promise. So asynchronous functions, they always return a promise. So you can kind of think of asynchronous functions as always wrapping the return value of your async function within a promise. So if we look at these two examples here, I have my async function called async function, and then I just have a regular function called function. And you can kind of think of these two as equivalent. In my async function, I just return the value of 1. But in my regular function, I return promise.resolve and I pass in 1 to return a promise here that is resolved with a value of 1. So these are effectively the same thing. Now, there are some like subtle nuances that these aren't actually the same thing, but it is an appropriate mental model to think of an async function just returning 1. Well, that is very similar to a regular function returning promise.resolve and passing 1 into it. So if I console log the return values of both of these functions, you're going to see that I get a promise with a value of 1 within both of these, because an async function, it's going to wrap whatever return value you have within a promise, similar to if you just had a regular function and you called promise.resolve and you wrapped that value within a promise. Now, you can handle this return value with a .then function, and you could get the value with a .then function just like you would with working with promises in general. So if I get rid of my console.log here and I attach a .then and I get the value of this function, and then I just console log the value here, you're going to see that in my async function, I'm going to be able to access the value of it by using this .then function, because this is going to return a promise here, and then I'm going to wait for that promise to resolve with my .then function. I'm going to get the value of my promise, and I'm just going to console log that out. So if you want to use the value of an async function, like I do here, you can just attach a .then, .catch, just like you would handle kind of regular promises there. Okay, and then if you're inside an async function, you could also await the resolution of a promise there. All right, so an async function within JavaScript, it is automatically going to return a promise, and it's going to wrap whatever return value you have within a promise. Now, as I mentioned in my overview, within an async function, we can use the await keyword. Now, the await keyword, it needs to be within an async function. There are some nuances to this, but for the most part, excluding some edge cases, await keyword needs to be used within an overall async function. And async functions, they can have 0 or more await keywords. They don't necessarily need to have an await keyword, just like in my examples I showed, nor is there a limit to the await keywords they have. And like I said in my overview, the await keyword, it will wait for some promise to resolve before it continues running a function. So in my async function here called async, I define a constant called data, and then I assign that to the return value of using the await keyword, and then I await a new promise here that resolves after 3,000 milliseconds or 3 seconds. So what JavaScript's going to do here is it's going to enter this async function, and then it's going to hit this line of code here. It's going to see this await keyword, which is telling JavaScript that I want to wait for some promise to become settled, to either fulfill or reject. And once it sees this await keyword, it's going to be like, okay, well, this promise, it's not resolved yet. It's going to take 3,000 milliseconds. So it's then going to exit the running of this async function. It's going to continue running all synchronous code throughout my JavaScript program. And then once all of my synchronous code is complete and this promise resolves or rejects here, it's going to come right back to this line of code here and continue running this async function. So once this promise resolves after 3,000 milliseconds, then data here is going to be assigned to whatever I resolve or reject my promise with. And then here I'm just going to console log my data. So if I run my async function here, what you should see is that I'm going to run it. There's going to be a slight pause of 3,000 milliseconds to where it runs the rest of my code here, which I don't call any functions in the rest of my code, so nothing else is going to happen. And then after 3,000 milliseconds, it's going to come back to this line of code and complete the running of this function. So if we look at my example, I ran my function and we see how it's waiting there for about 3 seconds, and then it console logs out 1. Because it hits this line of code, it exits this line of code, and just to show you that I'm not lying to you, let me just console log some synchronous code here. And I'm gonna just console log sync for synchronous. So what's gonna occur this time is we're gonna hit this line of code, JavaScript's gonna exit my function here, it's gonna run all other synchronous code throughout my program, and then once this promise resolves or rejects, it's gonna come back to this line of code, but only after it's run all synchronous code in the rest of my file here. So if I run this here, I would expect to console log sync here before I console log the value of 1. Because once it hits this line of code, it's going to exit this function. It's going to run this line of code because this is synchronous code. It's going to run all synchronous code. And then once my kind of synchronous code call stack is cleared, it will come back to the running of this function once this promise is resolved or rejected, and then it will console log out 1. So if I run this again here, we see that I console log out sync, and then after 3 seconds, I console log 1. Now, what happens here if I don't await this promise? I don't wait for this promise to resolve or reject. So let me get rid of this. And I'm going to get rid of this sync statement here as well, just to make things a little bit more clear. So if I run this now, what you should see here is me getting a pending promise because I'm not waiting for this promise to resolve or reject. And that's what I get. I get a pending promise here because I'm not waiting for this promise here. But if I do wait, then I'm waiting for that return value, and I will get the value of 1 after 3,000 milliseconds. Okay. Now within an async function, there's a bit of a different way compared to just using regular promises that you can handle promise rejections and different things like that. And the way that that is done is using a try catch block. And you can also use a finally block. So here within my async function called handle, I basically have the very same example here in which I define a constant called data and I assign it to the return value of a new promise that's going to resolve here after 3 seconds. and then I console log the data. But what I do here is I wrap that within a try block, which is basically telling JavaScript that, okay, I want you to try to run this asynchronous code here, but if there's some sort of error, like a network failure or something like that, if some error occurs while I'm trying to run this code within my try block, then it's going to enter this catch block here. And whatever error is thrown, that is going to be passed in to your catch statement here. So here I'm kind of capturing my catch error. But if no error occurs, then I'm just going to finish running my entire try block here. And then in either case, if I want to run some code in either case, then I'm going to add that to my finally block. So you can have these try, catch, and finally blocks here. So your try block, that is going to run to completion if no errors occur. And if no errors occur, you're not going to run your catch block. But if an error is thrown, then you are immediately going to be thrown into your catch block here. And in either case, you're going to run your finally block. And finally blocks might be useful if, like, say you have some state that you want to set to loading when you kick off a network request, and you don't really care. Like, regardless of whether your promise fulfills or rejects, you want to set your loading state to false. That would be a good use case of using a finally block, because that's going to run whether your promise resolves or rejects. So if I run this code here, right now, since I just resolve my promise, what you're going to see is that I'm just going to console log out my data here, which is going to be the value of 1. And then I am going to console log about time, because I am going to enter this finally block regardless in my program. So here you see that I'm first going to log out the value of 1, because I'm going to wait for my promise to resolve here. And then once that does resolve, I'm going to continue the running of this function, and I'm going to console log out 1. And then here, my finally block is going to run regardless. But if I change this to a reject here, what you're going to see is that this promise is actually going to reject. So I'm never going to hit this line of code here. It's just going to go straight into my catch block, and it's going to pass in whatever value I reject my promise with, which is the value of 1. And then I'm going to console log out error and this value of 1. So if I run this here, you're going to see that I do indeed console log out error with the value of 1, because this rejects, and I enter this catch block here. And then regardless of the situation, I'm going to keep running this finally block, whether a promise resolves or rejects. So async await in JavaScript, an async function is a function declared with the async keyword. And the await keyword can be used only within async functions, and allows you to pause your async function until some promise either resolves or rejects. And once you pause your function, you're going to continue to run all synchronous code throughout the rest of your program. But then once that promise resolves or rejects, you're going to come back into that function, and you're going to complete the running of that function. Now, async functions, they always return a promise. They will wrap their return value within a promise no matter what. And you can handle your async function kind of resolutions and rejections by wrapping your logic within try, catch, finally blocks to handle some different errors and things like that. So hopefully this video gives you a good understanding of how async await works within JavaScript, and that you took something away from it. So I appreciate you tuning in, and I'll see you in that next one.